Many Trump supporters have never even heard of the John Birch Society, or barely remember hearing about it. You would have to be very old to have experienced its heydays yourself. The JBS was an influence for Trump, his father, Mulvaney, Mike Pompeo, Alex Jones, and many others. Pompeo's career was supported by Koch Industries, whose patriarch was even a founding member. Communism during the Cold War killed and enslaved a lot of people, and it also had an extensive espionage program. The JBS was not content with regular anti-communist investigations and activism because there seemed to be a much larger problem. High-ranking people in the White House, the State Department, and also some very powerful industry titans had helped the communist revolution in Russia, had sold important technology to the Soviets, and somehow managed to fail at supporting the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War. On US soil, domestic socialists infiltrated the institutions of the state and society with the help of big money from the industry. The JBS drew its inspiration from older classic conspiracy literature and suggested that a group of international bankers, who were not Marxists or Soviet KGB agents, were using communism to achieve world domination. Certain industry clans, such as the Rockefellers and British Roundtable groups, supposedly worked for these bankers. There were enough interesting ideas in the JBS books, but there was one fatal flaw. The older conspiracy literature that influenced the JBS had been heavily manipulated by British intelligence. Certain crucial pieces of old disinformation were unfortunately rehashed by the JBS, and this causes massive problems to this very day. The Capitol riots, the QAnon cult, and a lot more goes back to the old disinformation. The JBS may have distanced itself from Nazi ideology, the fake protocols of Zion, and the notion of a Jewish-led satanic banker conspiracy. But still, the JBS bestseller books from Gary Allen and Cleon Skousen over-exaggerated the power of banks and central banks, over-exaggerated the role of Jewish bankers, and pushed the false narrative that Jewish bankers had managed to take over the British Empire and the US, with nothing but standard loans and some basic intelligence work. The Nazis had believed the same disinformation and subsequently fell for an Anglo-American deception campaign in which powerful right-wing US circles and the British aristocracy pretended to be friendly towards Germany. The ruse worked. Hitler abstained from an invasion of Britain and instead attacked the Soviet Union. Britain kept attacking the Nazis, America sent military gear to Russia, and then joined the war. The JBS advocated partnerships with powerful right-wing circles without understanding that these circles are not who they pretend to be. The more aggressive the JBS became, the more it fed into the left-wing paranoia. The left has a simplistic belief in a grand right-wing world conspiracy because of disinformation and viewed the JBS as lying shills for the super-rich who wanted a right-wing regime. We see the same misguided confusion today, and most people are not even aware they have been influenced by ideas that go back to the JBS. The old aristocracy had never really lost its power, but used its intelligence networks to create political parties, corporations, and banks as front groups. The aristocrats secretly controlled the ideologies and political movements such as conservatism, socialism, and even conspiracy literature. The large cluster of Welfen aristocrats, who ran the mighty British colonial empire and a range of smaller European kingdoms and principalities, was much bigger than most people realize, and its family-based central intelligence network was very sophisticated. British intelligence was running psychological warfare operations against the French even before the French Revolution. Conspiracy literature was circulated which depicted the French and the Vatican as Satanists behind every possible conspiracy. The French countered this with their own conspiracy media which depicted the Brits, its Protestant church, and Freemasonry as satanic and conspiratorial. British intelligence was destabilizing France through the Enlightenment movement and used front groups like the Illuminati of Bavaria. When Weishaupt's order got busted by the police and published captured documents, British intelligence launched a series of best-selling conspiracy books by authors such as John Robison and Augustin Baruel, which basically avoided any investigation into British and aristocratic intelligence. The most important members of the Illuminati were Welfen aristocrats closely related to the British throne. The House of Hessen-Kassel and the British throne controlled the Rothschild banking operation. Simultaneously, intelligence started to promote the fairy tale of the Rothschilds and other Jewish bankers taking over the British Empire. Anglo-American circles also heavily promoted the fake protocols of Zion after World War I as a ruse to soften German anger against Britain and the US. The international Jewish banker conspiracy was declared as the main reason for this war to happen. Let's look at some of the JBS star authors. G. Edward Griffin's book about the Federal Reserve does not sound much like classic Jewish world conspiracy lore, like for example Eustace Mullins's earlier work. But Griffin also has an exaggerated view of the Fed, which is only partially based on private institutions. It is not a Jewish private bank masquerading as an American institution. The first two central banks were run by the US establishment, not Jewish bankers from Europe. US presidents complained about the corruption which threatened the stability. The fairy tale goes that the Rothschilds, after magically taking over Britain without getting arrested or killed, took over the US. Cleon Skousen's books influenced Glenn Beck, Senator Orrin Hatch, Mitt Romney, Rick Perry, and many more. Skousen distances himself from the fake protocols of Zion, but then delivers the same old exaggerated narratives about Jewish banks. Among the sources Skousen cited to substantiate his claims in The Naked Capitalist was a former Tsarist army officer named Arsen Degulevich, whose own sources included Boris Brazol, a white Russian émigré who provided Henry Ford with the first English translation of the fraudulent protocols of the Elders of Zion, and later became a supporter of Nazi Germany. In his book, The Naked Capitalist, Skousen writes, "It should be noted in passing that while the Rothschilds and certain other Jewish families cooperated together in these ventures, this was by no means a Jewish monopoly, as some have alleged. Neither was it a Jewish conspiracy. As we shall see, men of finance of many nationalities and many religious or non-religious backgrounds collaborated together to create the superstructure of economic and political power, which Dr. Quigley is about to disclose." No student of the global conspiracy should fall for the Hitlerian doctrine that the root of all evil is a super-Jewish conspiracy. Nor should they fall for that long-since discredited document, The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which Hitler palmed off on the German people as an authentic declaration of policy by an all-Jewish Congress. But still, Skousen's descriptions create the impression that Jewish conspirators were above the non-Jewish ones. He does not understand that the aristocracy had taken over Jewish banking. He thought it was the other way around. Skousen's mind was preoccupied with the likes of Rothschild, Kuhn Loeb, Jacob Schiff, Bernard Baruch, Henry Morgenthau, Thomas Fortune Ryan, and the publisher of the New York Times, Adolph Ochs. Gary Allen was even more brazen with his best-selling book, None Dare Call It Conspiracy. He repeats the central falsehoods. Quote, "For centuries there has been big money to be made by international bankers in the financing of governments and kings. There is a king financing business, and to those who can ensure collection it is lucrative indeed. Certainly international bankers, who have loaned hundreds of billions of dollars to governments around the world, command considerable influence in the policies of such governments." End quote. But kings could easily start banks as front groups. When Allen writes about international bankers, the emphasis is of course on Jewish bankers like the Rothschilds. But he simply cannot explain how these small families were never arrested or killed by the kings, even though kings knew every trick in the book and had many tools to control bankers. Gary Allen writes, quote, "Preeminent in playing this game was the famous House of Rothschild. Its founder, Meyer Amschel Rothschild of Frankfurt, Germany, kept one of his 5 sons at home to run the Frankfurt Bank and then sent the others to London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. The Rothschilds became incredibly wealthy during the 19th century by financing governments to fight each other." End quote. The Rothschilds, like non-Jewish banks, collected loans when governments asked for this service. There was nothing unusual about it. Allen seems to think the kings were stupid. Of course, Allen has a lame little disclaimer in his book. Quote, "Anti-Semites have played into the hands of the conspiracy by trying to portray the entire conspiracy as Jewish. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The traditionally Anglo-Saxon JP Morgan and Rockefeller international banking institutions have played a key role in the conspiracy." End quote. Interestingly, he seems to portray the Rothschilds and other Jewish bankers as the leaders, even in his charts of the supposed power structure. He repeats the lie that Jews own various central banks in Europe. He repeats the lies about the first two US central banks. Quote, Gustavus Myers, in the History of the Great American Fortunes, reveals, under the surface, the Rothschilds long had a powerful influence in dictating American financial laws. The law records show that they were powers in the old Bank of the United States, abolished by Andrew Jackson. The man who was to play the most significant part in providing America with that central bank was Paul Warburg, who along with his brother Felix had immigrated to the United States from Germany in 1902, end quote. Allen's book is not too different from the older conspiracy literature that influenced the Nazis. Allen denies the notion of a Jewish-led conspiracy but puts Jews right front and center in his descriptions. It's only a small step for the reader to progress to other books who plainly state a Jewish-led conspiracy and focus on Jewish satanic cliches. The JBS bestsellers influenced the next generations of conspiracy influencers, and in the late 1990s, the internet took off. Today's more radical Trump supporters are inundated with old JBS narratives, and the resulting radicalism feeds the left-wing paranoia. Right-wingers hope endlessly for a right-wing uprising, and they hope the Putin regime of Russia will help them. Back then, it was Gary Allen who advocated getting in bed with powerful right-wing circles. Quote, it would be equally disastrous to lump all businessmen and bankers into the conspiracy. One must draw the distinction between competitive free enterprise, the most moral and productive system ever devised, and cartel capitalism, dominated by industrial monopolists and international bankers. The difference is the private enterpriser operates by offering products and services in a competitive free market, while the cartel capitalist uses the government to force the public to do business with him. These corporate socialists are the deadly enemies of competitive private enterprise. End quote. You can clearly tell the impact of the JBS on conspiracy influencers of the 70s, the 80s, and then the 90s, with people such as Alex Jones. And you can still see these impacts today. Alex Jones had hoped that the demonstration at the Capitol would bring him worldwide attention. With $400,000 from an anonymous major donor and another $100,000 from his own pocket, he had rented the most expensive spot at the Capitol, including a stage and portable toilets. 1 million people were supposed to cheer on Jones, and even Donald Trump himself was supposed to share the same stage. But everything turned out differently. The crowd barely listened to him. Some began to break through the barricades and enter the Capitol and riot. And nobody cared about Jones anymore. Instead, an unemployed actor with a buffalo fur hat and horns, the so-called QAnon shaman, became famous worldwide. The core of the QAnon myth is based on the worldview of the old-fashioned conspiracy media from the John Birch Society. For decades, the JBS audience hoped that a right-wing group with influence will finally strike a mega blow against the supposed left-wing world conspiracy. For the Q community, Donald Trump was the savior, but now he's gone and the Democrats now have majorities in the Senate and Congress in addition to the White House. The leaders of the Q circles, however, seem to continue unfazed. Alex Jones seems extremely upset that he is losing market share. In a telephone interview with the QAnon shaman, there was a lot of shouting. The shaman and Jones are not really that different. Jones also preached a Trump salvation doctrine, but without basing it on Q's cryptic nonsense postings from a message board. Entering the Capitol was less informative than Alex Jones's infiltration of the Bohemian Grove, but the differences aren't that big either. The shaman's costumes may be a bit ridiculous, but Jones has worn even worse costumes and makeup as PR stunts. The shaman is younger than Jones and looks significantly more handsome and has the cooler beard. Perhaps Jones fears that in a few years the shaman will be more successful than him and the Q cult will dominate conspiracy media. The shaman had consumed alternative media long enough to sound like a seasoned influencer pro or local politician on autopilot, pretending to know how the world works and how to save it. Why should people still listen to Jones instead of the shaman? Jones emphasizes the decades-long groundwork done by himself and traditionalists at the John Birch Society, such as Cleon Skousen or Ron Paul, who didn't rely on cryptic nonsense postings from an anonymous internet account and interpretations of said postings like you are reading tea leaves. Fair point, but the John Birch Society relied heavily on the older, highly manipulated conspiracy books. The scientist Carroll Quigley was quoted extensively by the JBS, but was not quoted correctly. Quigley complained that his research was grossly skewed and falsified by the JBS to fit into old, flawed narratives. The shaman doesn't really care about the traditionalists. He represents the new generation of conspiracy activists who are increasingly supplanting Jones, who is now one of the graying old-timers. But still, the basic foundation of the shaman is the old material from the JBS. Jones actually does have contacts with high-ranking figures like General Flynn, but they are also influenced by ideas from old conspiracy books of the Birch Society and the Echo Chamber, of which Jones is a member. Jones wants to know from the shaman what kind of special knowledge and special insight he has. The answer is his shamanic religious creed. Let's not forget that Jones had repeatedly stated, for example in the Joe Rogan podcast, that interdimensional aliens are behind the evil in the world. So, what's the great difference between Jones and the shaman? The only major difference is that the Q generation of influencers bases grand ideas on nonsense postings on the internet. Jones hates the shaman, but posts videos of David Icke, whose ideas, such as about interdimensional reptilioids, partly come from psychedelic intoxication and esoteric media. The Q crowd and the shaman want to go on and will not be deterred by the fact that the big announced blow against the left world conspiracy, the so-called plan, fell through, and the Democrats now have the White House and majorities in both Congress and the Senate. The shaman thinks that Trump was probably just part of a much larger plan. At that point, Jones goes completely ballistic, despite saying roughly the same thing in interviews. Trump is supposedly only part of one of several waves of the conservative revolution. We can expect Jones, the shaman, and many other influencers to just continue with the old JBS style of activism.